Hello, and welcome to our Share Plans Uncovered series, which aims to answer your frequently asked questions about employee share incentivisation schemes. I'm Fiona Bell, and with me today is Simon Adams and Martin Cooper. We are all partners in the RSM's Share Plans and Reward team. Today, we are looking at Enterprise Management Incentive Schemes, also known as EMIs, and asking, what are the tricky areas? EMIs are a statutory type of share option where employees and companies can become entitled to some very good tax benefits. However, because there are opportunities to get such good reliefs, there are also a lot of rules to ensure that companies qualify. So Martin, if I can start with you, what do you think is the trickiest part of qualifying for an EMI scheme?
I think you could pick one of a few different requirements, but I think a very common issue is where you've got a corporate shareholder. So there's something in the EMI legislation that says to be able to grant EMI options, the shares over which you're granting the option over can't be in a company that's under the control of another company, and there can't be any arrangements in place by which that company could come under the control of another company. So that's sometimes very straightforward. If a company owns 60% of the share capital, you might be clear that you're not going to get EMI tax relief. But there are many situations where it's less clear and it's more complicated. For example, you might have a company that owns a minority of the share capital, but they have what's often called investor protections. So they have enhanced voting rights in certain circumstances. So does that constitute control? Does that constitute an arrangement by virtue of which you could come under the control of another company? It's not always straightforward. Equally, you might have a company that owns a minority shareholding, but it's connected with an individual who also owns shares, and together they might have control, and that could sometimes breach the legislation. So it's not always straightforward. And where there is any uncertainty, where there is any complexity, the best approach tends to be to approach HMRC under something called the Advance Assurance procedure, and to get that comfort that you do qualify for EMI.
Thank you, Martin. Simon, I'd like to have a look at one of the other tests for EMIs, and that's the number of employees a company has. That sounds quite straightforward, but it isn't always.
No, it's not always. And what we're dealing with here is a 250 full-time employee cap, which, as you say, should be reasonably straightforward to count, but often isn't, where you're dealing with things like part-time employees, people whose working weeks aren't your typical one. So for those purposes, HMRC will often take, say, a 35-hour standard week, but can be prepared to accept others when you're trying to provide that full-time equivalent. So if you've got 300 part-time employees, then it might be that you still fall under that 250 employee cap. Another thing to bear in mind is you're not just dealing with employees of one company and the company that's offering the options. If you've got a larger group, you need to take into account all of those group companies when tossing up the 250 limit. And also taking into account things like agency workers, knowing when you shouldn't be counting them, that's really important. There are a few different ways of dealing with this. One you can't get around. You do need to assess these each time you grant an option, or have a process for making sure that you're not tipping over that 250. And where there are any areas of doubt, HMRC do offer a facility of advance assurance so that you can have that comfort that HMRC share your view that the company qualifies under that and other areas.
Thank you, Simon. Martin, looking a bit closer at the employees, who actually can participate in an EMI scheme?
Yeah, so that's important. So even if as a company you qualify to grant EMI options, that doesn't mean you can just grant them to everybody. And almost invariably, you're going to get in a company some people who can be granted EMI options and some people who can't be. One of the tests is called the working time requirement. And so essentially you have to work for 25 hours a week for the company. There's some relaxation of that for certain part-time workers, but that's broadly what the test is going to be. Another requirement is that you don't have a material interest in the company. You don't breach the 30% threshold in terms of your shareholding in the company, And you might also have to take into account shareholdings by other connected people as well as just your own. I think it's important to keep in mind two key categories really of people who definitely don't qualify to get EMI options, because this applies in many businesses. You can't grant EMI options to non-executive directors, and you can't grant EMI options to consultants. That's a critical thing to remember. And so for individuals that can't be granted EMI options, it might be unapproved options, so options without the tax advantage share treatment, but very often there's going to be better ways to structure it to get a good tax outcome for those individuals.
Thank you, Martin. Simon, coming back to you, you talked about the wider group. There are a few issues with subsidiaries, I believe. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so this really comes back to a little bit of what Martin was talking about around independence and looking at whether companies are under the control of other companies. And what we need for a qualifying EMI company is that any subsidiaries, so that's companies that are under the control of the companies that we're looking at, you need to make sure that your EMI group has a greater than 50% shareholding in any company that falls as a subsidiary, which also sounds a bit complicated and can be. And it can be really quite difficult where you're dealing with, say, your classic 50-50 joint venture style companies, because you don't meet that more than 50% condition, but under a joint venture arrangement, you can be said to have control. So really needs some detailed analysis where you do have any areas of uncertainty. It can rule you out of EMI altogether, and it can therefore mean that, yes, forced to look for something else. It's the kind of area, along with independence that Martin mentioned, that is quite a big bugbear of advisors and the broader industry. So probably something for the viewers watching this to lobby their MP on.
So there are quite a lot of rules and some problem areas when you're implementing an EMI. Thankfully, there are some alternative plans you can use, like a CSOP or a SIP. But many of these problems we have been able to navigate through at RSM by restructuring or finding other ways around by getting clearances with HMRC. So thank you, Martin, and thank you, Simon. If you'd like to know more about creating successful share plans, please visit our website to watch the rest of our share plan series or contact us using the details below. Thank you.